Thank you again to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support. And I also would like to say that this event is sponsored in part with the foundation, with the support of the family of Pat Finley. So we would like to thank the family of Pat Finley too for their support of the foundation and their support of the museum. Today we are welcoming Marquette University professor, Dr. Alison Efford, and she's going to be talking about the German feminist in the Civil War. Dr. Efford is, like I said, a professor of history at Marquette, and is a historian of immigration in the 19th century United States. And she works with questions of race and power that stand at the center of her work, which typically intertwines cultural, social, and political analysis. Dr. Efford, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'll start with thanking you, Eric, for the invitation, and thanking everyone for, I guess, coming out, logging on on a Monday. I forgot that this was going to be on Zoom, and I was about mentally to sort of plan my trip to Madison, and I was a bit disappointed when I realized, oh, I don't have to leave my study out right here in Milwaukee. But maybe with the snow, I don't know. It's kind of nice not to have to venture out. But I'm very glad to be here virtually and to be able to share some of my work this way. I need to start with some introductions of my own. So I think when you're using people's first names and you're reading their letters and you are picking apart their relationships, it seems at least sort of fair to introduce them first. Mathilde Franziska Anneke was born in 1817 in Prussian Westphalia, now part of Germany. And she was born into an upper middle class family that fell on hard times. She was essentially married off at age 19, and it was a terrible marriage. Her husband drank a lot and he was physically abusive, and she spent several years trying to extract herself and her baby from this marriage. And that experience of struggling to get a divorce in the 19th century in Prussia really inspired her lifelong feminism. So in the late 1840s, she wrote a treatise, Das Weib in Konflikt mit dem sozialen Verhältnissen, which is woman in conflict with society, where she argued that the laws and the conventions surrounding marriage essentially enslaved women. During the revolutions that were across Europe in 1848 and 1849, Mathilde Anneke published a dissident newspaper in Cologne, and Cologne was really a hotbed of radicalism at this time. And then she became famous for actually fighting in the conflict in Baden, in the southern part of Germany, where she was fighting for a German republic, sort of unified and democratic. And that's the picture that you can see here, if you can see your screen. She had just recently given birth to her second child, second husband, and she dons trousers and she follows her husband, Fritz Anneke, down to Baden, and she served as what they called an Ordnanzoffizierin, sort of a military aide on the battlefield, an orderly, but not in a medical sense. She was more running messages. The revolutions failed. The revolutions of 1848 failed, and like many other 48ers, Mathilde fled to the United States. She had a really difficult decade after she arrived. The 1850s were not good to her. She lost 4 of her children to disease. They died. She started a feminist newspaper, but it folded. And she grew apart from her second husband. She would later go on to open a girls' school and become founding vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. So don't worry too much. Things get better. But if we look at that moment in the late 1850s, she's living in Milwaukee, and her life has hit a real low. Enter Mary Booth. So here's my second introduction. You can see Mary Booth seated here in a picture with Matilda. Mary was born in Connecticut, and she was about 14 years younger than Matilda. She would go on in the 1860s to publish poetry and translations and some other writing. But if we look at the late 1850s, Mary Booth's chief sort of claim to fame was the fact that she was married to Sherman Booth. Whoop. Sherman Booth, it's a name that's still somewhat known around Milwaukee in the right circles. There's a Booth Street. He was Wisconsin's leading abolitionist during this period, late 1850s, and he was in and out of jail because of his part in helping a man named Joshua Glover. So Glover had been enslaved in Missouri, but he escaped slavery and he made his way to southern Wisconsin. But US authorities, federal marshals, were trying to capture Glover under the Fugitive Slave Act and return him to his enslaver in Missouri. So in 1854, Sherman Booth riled up the crowd that broke Glover out of jail where he's being held in Milwaukee and made sure that he could head on up to Canada. My colleague Victoria Billich and I have edited and translated a selection of remarkably revealing letters that follow the relationship between Mathilde Franziska Anneke and Mary Booth from 1859 to 1865, right? So 1859, that's right on the eve of the Civil War. And then 1865 is when the fighting in the Civil War ends, right? So our letters really cover this period of the Civil War. I really think the book could make a great movie. It's the story of whether Matilda and Mary's love will survive. I can imagine this, a movie trailer with sort of stirring music and kind of a big movie voice, not a New Zealand accent like mine. So they face obstacles. Sherman Booth rapes a 14-year-old. Fritz Anneke, Matilda's husband, is court-martialed in the Union Army. The two women take 3 of their children and they leave Milwaukee and go live in Zurich, Switzerland. And they're publishing anti-slavery, pro-union, anti-slavery and pro-union, pro-US work, but they are desperately poor, and Mary has tuberculosis. So I can imagine this trailer building up suspense over how things are going to go for these two women. I think the movie's through line really does need to be this relationship. This romantic friendship is kind of what ties together the narrative arc of our book. And it wasn't typical for two women to raise children together and to leave a really extensive record of their feelings toward each other. So I do want to talk about that, about the nature of the relationship. But I suspect that many of you are a bit more interested in the aspects of the story that relate to the Civil War itself. So anti-slavery politics in Wisconsin, and then also the court-martial system in the Union Army. So there's something for everyone in this movie. Historians do know about romantic friendship, specifically between women. They know that what we call romantic friendship, it doesn't really fall neatly into today's categories of straight or lesbian. It could be really intense. It could sort of have erotic overtones. It could be consuming. But we don't exactly know what they did in bed, and romantic friends did not identify as lesbian. They never said we are lesbians, and that category didn't really exist as it does today until the late 1800s. So in the Victorian period, right, the mid 1800s, it's a period that's famous for the veneration of the sort of nuclear family, the heterosexual nuclear family. But it's also a time when it's really socially acceptable in the United States and in Europe for women to have really close, intense relationships and to hold hands and to speak lovingly of each other. I find that often historians flatten romantic friendship. They sort of want to make romantic friends either into sort of just friends, but in this weird 19th century way, or into sort of lesbians who didn't know that they were lesbians. But the romantic friends themselves at the time refused to kind of recognize that there was a line between kind of the erotic and the platonic. And my approach is to look at this relationship and sort of see what it meant to them. It didn't shock people at the time, but it was still very powerful, and it's interesting to look at how that worked. Matilda and Mary met in Milwaukee in either very late 1858 or very early 1859. And within a few months, Matilda had moved into the Booth household to care for Mary. Mary was sick. She had a whole range of symptoms, the most ominous of which was coughing up blood. And Matilda would stay up nights looking after Mary. Matilda, for her part, was still reeling from the loss of 4 children, as you would. And Mary, she'd lost the baby herself and was very good at comforting Matilda. And they would go to the grave of Mary's baby, Forest Home Cemetery, if I have any locals. And they would grieve together, and the two women really became inseparable. In Matilda and Mary's case, this sort of sense of mutual comfort came along with a probing of the boundaries of women's proper roles. So when Mary first met Matilda, she wrote really admiringly of her. Picture of a letter. Mary wrote really admiringly of Matilda to her sister, to Mary's sister, and saying that Matilda had been in battle. So talking about what had happened in Baden, had been in battle like Joan of Arc. And then in a later letter to Mary's mother, Mary said, "Matilda wishes I could have been in battle with her." Then 2 exclamation marks. Which suggests that the two had discussed it and sort of spent time thinking about how Matilda's experience in this masculine realm related to their relationship to each other. At the same time, Mary seemed to sense that her mother might not exactly approve of Matilda's unconventional activities. So Mary insisted to her mother that Matilda had fought in Baden because of her love of country, wanting a unified Germany, and also her love of her husband, that she was with her husband at the time. Mary misleadingly wrote that Matilda, quote, hates American women's rights females. That's a strange sort of comment. I think that Mary was getting at the point that Matilda's sort of style of feminism was quite different from the Anglo-American style of feminism. But later on, and to some extent already, Matilda was connected to those networks. She would work with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She would work with Susan B. Anthony. She attended women's rights conventions on the East Coast. So I think that Mary is sort of anticipating her mother's objections to Matilda and trying to head them off. In these same letters, Mary can't help but sort of gush about Matilda. She says she's beautiful. She has all these achievements. She's a great writer. Everybody respects and admires her. So that relationship is developing, and Matilda's care for Mary extended into the quite public role of trying to protect Mary from the fallout when Sherman Booth was put on trial for seduction. So something that we didn't expect when we started working on these letters. So Sherman was famous in the late 1850s. He was 46 years old in 1859. Caroline Cook was 14, and Mary had gone away to a wedding. So Caroline had come over to take care of the Booth girls, to babysit and sort of play with, occupy the two Booth girls who were younger. Caroline was sleeping in Mary's room when Sherman came in naked and got into bed with her and penetrated her twice. Booth's lawyers claimed, and I am ready to believe, that he was only prosecuted because he was a Republican. So Republican, the party of Lincoln, right? Sherman Booth was involved in Republican Party politics, and he was one of the more radical anti-slavery people in the Wisconsin Republican Party. So his lawyers said, oh, this is just the Milwaukee Democrats looking for a chance to take down a political rival. And Dyken Corson, the district attorney of Milwaukee, who you see pictured there, he was a Democrat. And in another political context, I can imagine Sherman Booth settling this matter informally. He tried to go to Caroline's father and sort of said, what do I need to pay you to kind of get this called off? And I can see that sort of in a different context, that might have been the way it went. The age of consent at the time was 10. So Booth's attack did not qualify as statutory rape. And as I said, the charge was seduction. A majority of US states had or would pass these seduction laws, most states between 1848 and 1885. And in Wisconsin, a man could get 1 to 5 years in prison if he was found to have seduced and had illicit connection with any unmarried female of previously chaste character. And I'm not sure if you're anticipating this, but it really does put the reputation of the girl or woman on trial, right? She has to sort of, part of the trial is going to be, is she of chaste character before this happens? So it does really set up a trial that could be pretty harrowing for the woman or the girl. Sherman was not found guilty. Long story short, you can read the whole trial transcript if you're interested. There was a hung jury. But based on the letters that we transcribed and translated, I can tell you that people who knew Sherman Booth best believed that he was guilty of forcing a minor to have intercourse with him. So it was actually Mary Booth who had told Caroline Cook's father that she came home and saw Sherman Booth and Caroline Cook in bed together. And you can see that in the testimony that Caroline Cook gave in court on the left-hand side of the screen. And Sherman Booth really blamed Mary for this whole sort of public scandal, because he sort of said, oh, it's Mary, if it hadn't been for you, then no one would have known about this. And Sherman Booth and his lawyers tried really hard to get Mary Booth to retract her comment. And we have that in one of our letters. It was an English letter that Mary Booth sent to her mother. She said that one of the lawyers said to me, you thought that he was guilty, that you did right, but now you've changed your mind. You believe now that he was not. But Mathilde and Mary both tried to stop Sherman and his lawyers digging up dirt on this girl. And Mary wrote to Fritz, we are aware of Sherman's good qualities, you and I both, but the evil instincts that lead him to seduce innocent girls, you may not have heard about his lewd desires as much as I am hearing about them now. He is evil in the true sense of the word. Mathilde and Mary never changed their opinion of the attack, and Sherman's daughters wouldn't have anything to do with him for the rest of their lives. Before the trial, Fritz Anneke had left Milwaukee to go back to Europe to work as a reporter, while Mathilde and her two young children stayed with the Booths in Milwaukee. During that time, Mathilde wrote to Fritz, "Dear Fritz, we should never have married. We should have stayed friends, and we may both have led happier lives. And indeed, we love each other more like friends now. We love each other since we are most intimately related through the children we have together. But we do not love each other like lovers who both feel that their desire for each other fills their existence and can only be satisfied by the touch of pure lips when they kiss." This little quote gives you a bit of a sense of, well, Mathilde had very high expectations of her relationship. She was kind of intense. It also gives you a sense of how Fritz and Mathilde's relationship was changing. Sort of like, we can stay friends, we have these kids together, we'll be good co-parents, but the spark is gone. And Mathilde focused increasingly on Mary. She would write to Fritz about how much she loved Mary. She would talk about kissing Mary, about holding hands, and provide a lot of that sort of detail about the importance of that relationship to Fritz. And then in the summer of 1860, Mary finally decides to leave Sherman, which I think good decision. And Mary takes one of her daughters and the two Anneke children, and Mathilde and Mary and these three children set off for Zurich, Switzerland. On their way out of the country, Mathilde visits family in Newark, and Mary visits family in Connecticut. And we have a letter from Mathilde to Mary at that point. Most of this letter is in Mathilde's English, which is charming, but very difficult to understand. It's about arrangements of how to sort of where they're going to meet in New York and getting the passports lined up and the money and all those sort of logistics. And then Mathilde wrote, burn this letter when you have half understood it. And then a few sentences later, she switches over to German and she says, I dedicate my life to you. Even if you have lost everything, you still have me, and my true love for you is eternal. And in the end of the letter, she says, please know that no other heart beats for you like the heart of your Franziska Maria. So they're about to leave Sherman behind, and Mathilde's really committing herself to Mary. I have to say that the burning reference, I don't think is entirely clear. Perhaps Mathilde was sort of embarrassed that her English wasn't very good and she didn't want that to hang around for, I guess, for historians like me to make fun of. But perhaps she wanted to conceal the relationship. And I'm thinking here maybe from Mary's mother, because Mary was staying with her mother at the time. I think likewise that the use of the German language, switching between languages, it's a bit ambiguous what that means, why she's doing that. Maybe it's because her English isn't very good, and if she wants to sort of pour out these very heartfelt feelings, she wants to use a language that's close to her heart. Or maybe she's using German to sort of conceal these feelings that might not be entirely approved of. Either way, there's a sort of sense of an alluring, secretive mode of communication that's sort of using both English and German. And I would add that they call each other Maria and Franziska Maria. That's what they call each other. No one else calls them those names. They're sort of pet names. The most explicit letters, I think we're still pretty G-rated, but the most explicit letters that survive come from Mary in Zurich while the two women and their children are living there. They were briefly living with Fritz in the same house as Fritz, but pretty soon Fritz leaves to go back to the United States because he wants to fight in the Civil War. The Civil War started and he wants a chance to be part of something that he really believes in, fighting for a union and ultimately against slavery. He was anti-slavery from the start, but the war only slowly became sort of a war against slavery. So that was a bit of an aside. They've been with Fritz, but Fritz has gone back to the United States, and now it's the two women and the three children. This is a poem that Mary wrote to Mathilde for Christmas, 1862. I have but one little thing, scarcely worth the offering. Yet this little thing I hold never could be bought for gold, not for all the pearls and gems in the world's bright diadems. Though it is of little worth, it is all I have on earth. It may not be found or bought, yet I give it all unsought. Take and lay it on the shelf, for it only is myself. I know that's a very physical image. Mary sort of objectifying herself, thinking of herself as an object. She's not a soul or a spirit or a scent. Those things do come up in other letters. But she is something that could be laying on a shelf. I like this one a bit better, I have to say. It's just a little note in pencil, Mary to Mathilde when they're both in Switzerland. Pardon me, my dear, for writing you such a miserable little note saying I was unhappy. I am indeed very happy when I think of your sweet love. It glorifies every evening and illuminates the darkest midnights. You are the morning star of my soul, the beautiful auroral glow of my heart, the saintly lily of my dream, the deep dark rosebud unfolding in my bosom day by day, sweetening my life with your ethereal fragrance. Dearest, you are the reality of my dreams. My life, my love, I have no more sorrow. I have you, my dear and dearest friend. Good night. Sort of like swoon. We all deserve 19th century love notes, I think. I do think to modern ears that ending with your friend feels almost as though she's sort of cutting the legs out from the whole thing. It's like, oh, just friends then. But I think in this context, I see this a bit more as evidence that Mary would have never said just friends. She would have said friends, and friends to her was associated with all these very intense imagery, all this very intense imagery, the morning star of my soul, the rosebud enfolding in my bosom. So that it's interesting, the combination there. In addition to the sort of sentimentality, there's also some jealousy going around. Mary wrote to Matilda about flirting with Ferdinand Lassalle, who's a big name, German socialist, and that sort of made Matilda bristle a bit. And another woman, Cecilia Kapp, wrote to Matilda, and we have this sort of piece of letter, this letter is a piece of evidence. Cecilia wrote to Matilda, and Cecilia was upset because Matilda had apparently told her that they couldn't have a relationship. Matilda and Cecilia couldn't have a relationship because Matilda didn't want to be, quote, unfaithful to Mary. Meanwhile, the two women were closely following the Civil War. They published this abolitionist fiction, which I've mentioned, and also opinion pieces on the war. They wrote together, and they wrote in German for German American newspapers and also German newspapers in Europe. And they are pushing for the end of slavery to be a war aim from the very beginning. Interestingly, Matilda has always seen violence as a way to effect the sort of changes she wanted. So we look, think back in Baden, she supported John Brown, who tried to instigate an uprising among enslaved people in Harper's Ferry before the war. So she was pro-John Brown. And she really took quite an interest in the military developments of the war. Sometimes it's sort of like she wished she could be out there because she was frustrated at Fritz a lot. This combination of her wanting an end to slavery and being interested in the military aspects of the war led her to complain to Fritz about Abraham Lincoln's prosecution of the war, especially his slowness to support emancipation. So in March of 1862, she wrote, "The divine institution," she means slavery, "slavery will continue to exist until the last war, which the Negroes will fight themselves." It's almost a sort of apocalyptic vision of slavery ending when Black people took up arms, but it's also sort of Matilda recognizing the important role that Black men and women played in pushing emancipation as a war aim. And of course, 10% of the Union Army was Black. After the Emancipation Proclamation, Matilda and Mary stay with supporting Lincoln, sort of as loyal critics of Lincoln, which was unlike many German Americans who actually wanted the Republican Party not to renominate Lincoln. They supported John Fremont for the presidency in 1864 because they saw Fremont as more radical. He would be more anti-slavery, and they thought would lead the war in a way that would be more commensurate with the goals that these radical German American 48ers had. The women, they kept up with the interpersonal dramas of the German officers in the Union Army, which I can tell you that just must have been almost a full-time job, because there are all sorts of conflicts among the German Americans in the officer corps. I have put up a picture of August Willich, Brigadier General August Willich, who's one of the most successful German generals, the most liked German generals in the Civil War. And Fritz looked at people like August Willich, and he couldn't understand why other people like Karl Schurz and Franz Sigel, their careers were going gangbusters, and Fritz, just his career was going nowhere. And he had been in the Prussian army. He got kicked out because of his radicalism and a dueling incident, but he thought very highly of his own military skills. And he thought that there was only one reason why these other German Americans were getting ahead, and he wasn't. There was a conspiracy against him. So Fritz was initially quite optimistic, right? This was going to be his chance to prove himself and also stand up for something he believed in. He was commissioned as a colonel commanding a Wisconsin regiment, but he really wanted to see frontline action. He was frustrated. He didn't feel like he was going to get to do the sort of thing he wanted to do. So he resigned, and he accepted command of an Indiana regiment. And then he resigned again. And then he just headed off to Tennessee, sort of thinking, oh, if I show up, surely someone's going to recognize my skills and give me a job. And he was a captain. He sort of accepted service at a lower rank, at a captain's rank in an Illinois regiment. And then finally he got granted command of the 34th Wisconsin Infantry, which was stationed at Fort Halleck, which was far western Kentucky on the Mississippi River, near the town of Columbus. You can see a picture on your screens. So Fritz arrives at Fort Halleck thinking this is the time when his career is going to take off, but things really came to a head because Fritz felt as though there were Freemasons around who had it in for him. They were in cahoots against him, that there was this Freemason conspiracy. Fritz ended up insulting and defying another colonel, Isaac Messmore, colonel of the 31st Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. Messmore was the superior colonel and the commander at Fort Halleck. So although they had the same rank, Fritz finds himself subordinate to this Mason, a colonel who was a Freemason, who Anneke does not personally get along with, and then that he stands up to Fritz Anneke stands up to Messmore, and things go south. He ends up being charged with mutiny and disobeying orders, and he's put on house arrest or cabin arrest actually just near Fort Halleck. In April, he wrote to Messmore's superior, I respectfully inform you that I cannot submit any longer to the exercise of a petty tyranny which has kept me now for 7 days in close confinement, because in a private letter I have in plain English rebuked the insulting impudence of a man who by chance, whether justly or not, I do not know yet, is placed over me as a superior. To be treated in such a way like a criminal must revolt even a lamb. I inform you that I shall break my close confinement and that I am ready to stand the consequences. Now, there are a few extra twists or turns, but basically, Fritz does leave. He just leaves house arrest, and he ends up getting as far as Cairo, Illinois, before he is turned back and sent back to face military justice. Ultimately, the court-martial passed down a decision of military degradation, and Fritz was kicked out, essentially. Mathilde felt that Fritz had been wronged, but she was also kind of frustrated with him. She didn't think he was doing a great job, and she was embarrassed. She wrote in May of 1863, "Your strengths and defiance should be directed toward things other than such miserable and humiliating quarrels. Disgrace triumphs and you come out on the short end. You always get caught up in such affairs due to your irritability." And I have to say, whatever the justice of the claims of corruption, I would not have liked to be Fritz's superior officer. Relationships matter, and Fritz didn't seem to understand that. But the movie has to end with, so that's my sort of, in conclusion, we have to return back to the relationship between Mathilde and Mary. Mary's health was rapidly declining, and she believed that if she went back to the United States, so they're still in Zurich, her health is declining. She believes that she can go back to the United States. She has friends who'll be able to pay for experimental medical treatment. And also her older daughter had stayed in Connecticut with her mother, and she wants to see her daughter again. So she left Zurich to go back to the United States. And Mathilde was devastated by this separation. She wrote about that to Fritz. I would say her response to the devastation was really to disengage emotionally. She didn't reply to Mary's letters. Mary was in New York City sending all these letters to Mathilde that have survived. And Mathilde just sent only a few back, a handful back. And these are really pleading, heartbreaking letters about the condition of her health and why aren't you replying to my letters? And Mary died within a year. She died the same month that the Civil War ended, April 1865. "My beloved Mary is no more," Mathilde wrote to Fritz. Mary was the great love of Mathilde's life. The relationship was one of caring devotion, and it had a bit of a passionate charge. Instead of thinking about how we can squeeze that romantic friendship into our modern categories, lesbian or straight, I think it's more interesting to consider how we can use this friendship to kind of interrogate, question, think about our categories. I do think this was a queer relationship, but it predated the categories of lesbian and straight. The existence of romantic friendship suggests that the distinction between the erotic and the platonic isn't such a clear one, which might give you pause, make your head spin a little bit. If we think more practically, Mary and Mathilde's relationship sustained them when their husbands had failed them. The husbands don't come out very well in this story. The relationship allowed them to pursue their writing careers together. It energized Mathilde to fight conventions that she believed enslaved women. It helped Mary and Mathilde stand up to Sherman Booth's demand that Mary side with him in the seduction trial and impugn the 14-year-old Caroline. It helped Mathilde bounce back from the ignominy of having a husband discharged from the army. Our book champions the importance of relationships. Relationships, they make a difference in political affairs and military affairs too. Relationships matter. Thank you. We'll stop my share.
Well, it's always fascinating to I mean, especially here at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, we get pretty much the same viewpoint of the Civil War. It changes just a little bit, but not very much. So it's always fascinating to get such a different viewpoint. Not only are you highlighting the female experience during this time period, but also the female experience from somebody who's not originally from America. And so I just found that fascinating. And it was just such a different viewpoint to be presented, especially with no war. There was really no war in there at all. So I thought that was really well put out there, Dr. Efford. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much. And I can imagine if people were expecting more military history, it might give them pause, coming from quite a different perspective.
No, and because we're not necessarily a war museum, but most of the things we do talk about center around the actual conflict, combat, and so it was just refreshing to have a different take on everything. And we do have quite a few questions as well, if you're ready for those.
Sure, shoot.
Excellent. The first one just came in via chat, so I'll go over that one first because I don't have that one in the PowerPoint. But one of our guests wants to know, throughout the letters that you were going through to put this book together, was there any coverage or any mention of riots in Milwaukee due to the draft? And then also, having come from a society of mandatory service in Prussia, did you find any evidence of that in there at all?
I think this is a fascinating subject, and it didn't come through particularly strongly in the letters because no one was in Milwaukee by the time that there's really that concerted resistance to the draft. I recently just read, it's another person you might be good to have on. Anders Bo Rasmussen has written about Scandinavians in Wisconsin and their resistance to the draft. And it's really interesting because some of these immigrant groups, and with the Scandinavians, they vote heavily Republican, but when they came to actually serving, they were faking injuries, they were kind of doing all these things. But then, of course, after the war, they're 3 months when they actually had to go off and fight. They're very sort of proud of their service. I think with the Germans, it's tricky because you have some really, I would say, radical people, right? Like Mathilde and Fritz. These were radicals. And you have some really sort of powerful figures. But then you also, the Germans, they're kind of across the political spectrum, and there are a lot of German speakers. If you're kind of local around here, a bit north, Ozaukee County, Washington County, who were actively sort of resisted, like physically resisting the draft when the draft came to their communities. And I would like to know more about what was going on in Milwaukee. There was a lot of contention, but I think there's room for us to get closer to that experience.
Oh, sure. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen here. I was just formulating that last question, so please disregard. Maybe I'll get a chance to finish it before we finish up here. What was your most surprising element of your research, Alison?
I guess the seduction trial did surprise me. That wasn't what I was in for. And then I started, and it really was so very public. And at a time when kind of Me Too and what do we do in cases of sexual assault? It just it just sort of seemed to take us on a whole different tangent. I guess another thing that surprised me was the children, what a role the children sort of played in the story, and the sort of like, it sort of resonated with me as a parent, sort of like, how do we make sure our children get a good education? But of course, like these children were separated from their fathers, and that was really quite stressful for the Anneke children, because they really worried what was happening to Fritz in the war. But they would also try to follow it, and they had sort of model soldiers, and they would do little displays and try to work out what was going on. So the role of children in the story surprised me. And then the seduction trial, sort of like, there were so many things that I sort of thought, we thought, oh, this will be an easy little project, you know, a side project. We'll just translate some letters, we'll transcribe them and translate them. It'll be quick and easy. And then you sort of get into it and you're like, oh my goodness, this is far more complicated than I envisioned.
Yeah, no, and I guess when you bring up the children, that's another good point as well. You know, that kind of goes back to the sort of the home front experience, you know, that we hear a lot about, particularly when it comes to the world wars. But when you look at other conflicts, the home front experience doesn't seem to be that detailed. And so you're right. You know, how do you figure out your child's education, and how you're just going to do regular things that everybody takes for granted, but when you're put in the middle of wartime, and particularly when you're in combat zones, whether it's, you know, Fort Halleck in Kentucky or you know, anywhere in the modern world today, it's just those things that you, like you said, you take for granted, but it just becomes so much more significant and so much more, I guess, haphazard to try to put together. So that portion about the children, I find that kind of fascinating. And then, yeah, the seduction trials. Oh my God, I had to pick myself up off the floor when you said the age of consent is 10 years old. I'm just, I can't even wrap my mind around that. It just doesn't seem even logical. But then again, you can't take the past and try to you know, lay it over the present either. So let's see the next question. If I can get my stuff working here. What led you to these letters, and then to go write this book?
My first book was on German immigrants and race and citizenship in the Civil War, and it had focused mostly, I would say, on male actors and kind of the debate over slavery and emancipation, and then the Reconstruction amendments, and how German Americans were involved in the politics. And I knew of Mathilde Anneke. She sort of makes little cameos. And I knew that there was this big collection. It's at the State Historical Society in Madison. But it's in this weird handwriting, this Kurrentschrift, this old-fashioned German handwriting. And I knew that I couldn't read. I think there were like 2,000 letters in there. So it was like, oh, there's no way. I can read German, but just the transcription was a problem in itself. And then I met Victoria Billich, who was born in Germany, and she works at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and she is a translation professor. So she is really interested in the language, and it kind of gave me a whole new insight into, I understand German, and I put together some, you know, translations when I need to use quotations, but she could really approach the whole project from that translation literary standpoint. And I figured with two of us, we can sort of bite off some of this project. And as I said, it turned out to be a lot more interesting than we expected in terms of the story. And historians, we're usually kind of loners. It was kind of fun to work with someone else, and when you kind of sort of like, how should we translate that? We could go back and forth, and so it was a really sort of meaningful collaboration in that way.
Well, how fortunate too to have somebody with such a specialized, you know, focus right there in the same city as you. Yeah. Although teaching at different universities, but still, you don't come across that very often. You mentioned Mathilde fighting in the revolutions of 1848. How common was it for women to be engaged, not necessarily in the combat itself, but even just to participate in military maneuvers like she did? How common was that?
there are examples, that there are names that we have of women who were sort of similarly active. Amalia Struve, the wife of another Civil War officer, Gustav Struve. I'm trying to remember Gustav. I think he maybe got to the level of major, or maybe he was a colonel. But so there are figures sort of similar to Mathilde Anneke. And then when you look at the sort of peasant side, there were so many different things going on in 1848. It's kind of these writers and journalists like the Annekes. And then it's also kind of popular peasant uprisings, people, because the causes were kind of varied, that nobody was happy, and there were lots of reasons to be upset. Lots of people were hungry, but then there were also freedom of speech issues, and all these little principalities, and all these sorts of things going on in Europe. So we do see women who are more sort of involved in the peasant side of things, who are alongside men. But it was fewer, so it is unusual, and it's interesting from a German perspective. If you think of it from the way that Germans look back at this movement, Germans sort of see this kind of what could have been. It's this moment where you have a lot of people like Mathilde Anneke and Fritz Anneke, Karl Schurz, August Willich, all these sorts of people who wanted a democratic Germany, and then when they couldn't, they left. So it's kind of this stream of democratic agitation that left German history, kind of exited, and then German history went on without them. So the Germans are very interested to see someone like Mathilde Anneke, who was articulating a sort of women's rights perspective when feminism wasn't very strong in German Europe, in the German countries that became Germany. It was much stronger in England, and the British Isles, and in Anglo-America. So this is someone that Germans can look back on and say, hey, look, there were these sort of important people, they just left.
And that kind of segues excellently right into the next question. You did talk, or at least alluded to, the difference between American feminism and European feminism. Can you just maybe discuss those details a little more elaborately?
It has a lot to do with religion, because Anglo-American feminism, and I guess I'm thinking in a relatively restricted box there, right? So there were women who were sort of advocating for themselves in all sorts of ways, but when we think about the movement, we think about people like Lucretia Mott and Stanton and Anthony. They really came out of circles that had organized for the abolition of slavery, and that were really closely connected to Protestant churches. And that was sort of true in England too. It has a very Protestant kind of valence to it, a Protestant sort of tone, the movement does. Mathilde had grown up Catholic and then got sort of really disillusioned with the Catholic Church, partly because of the divorce and just the politics in Europe. So by the time that we get to the late 1850s, she thinks of herself as a heathen. She actually calls herself a heathen, and she's really quite critical of Yankee, she would have said, the Yankee reform movements, especially because those Yankee reform movements, they tended not to like alcohol, and that brought them in conflict with the German immigrants. So it was sort of just this cultural difference. And Mathilde tries to get the Anglo-American feminists to kind of not be so hard on drinking, not be so hard on the immigrants. And then she tries to get the immigrants to kind of listen to what these people have to say about women's rights. She's sort of in the middle, kind of trying to deal with those two constituencies.
You're kind of like a referee of sorts.
Yeah.
And then the last question we have, you spoke of the conflicts within the German-American fighting elements. Can you talk about those in a little more detail as well?
Goodness. It's sometimes quite challenging to work out what was at the root of this. so-and-so doesn't like so-and-so, why? And they'll be rehashing things that happened in Baden. Like, you made this decision, or you got this credit when it was really me back in Baden in 1848, 49. So it's sometimes, it's kind of nice when you could actually map it onto US politics. You could say, oh, well, that person was really in favor of emancipation and this person was prepared to wait a little bit. But often it's just like, oh, they really didn't like each other, or they're refighting some battle from 15 years ago, and it's really complicated. And there's also, I don't know, if the person wants to reach out to me, I could sort of point them in different directions. The people who were Marxist get into sort of fights with people who were just socialists, right? So and there again, it's kind of like, what exactly is at stake here? It's very complicated to kind of unpick the differences and perspectives, but they will fight over very specific points regarding communism, socialism, Marxism.
I think that's one thing that we kind of forget here in the States too. We always talk about the European regiments and the Norwegian regiments and the German regiments, and how much they contributed to the Civil War effort. But especially with the Germans, I guess we kind of forget that they went through all this, just like you said, 15 years ago in Germany. And then now they're carrying all these little things with them over here to the US. And then you're mixing them back up again. I could just totally see how they would start to come up, and all these old sentiments, all these old feelings would just regenerate. That's another fantastic point you bring up. Well, Dr. Efford, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to thank everybody who signed on and joined us for this talk as well. I hope everybody has a great Monday. And my phone is ringing. Shoot.
Must be time to go.
No. But I'd just like to thank everybody. And again, Dr. Efford, thank you very much. If you ever find yourself in Madison, stop by the museum, say hi to us. We'd love to talk to you and see you in person. And for everybody, I hope you have a great Monday, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget, trivia is tomorrow night. So if you haven't signed up for our trivia, please do. We look forward to seeing everybody come out for that. And we have movie discussion night coming up at the end of next week. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.